By late November 1812, the road from Moscow to the Polish border was paved not with cobblestones, but with corpses. An army that had once numbered over 600,000 men, the largest military force ever assembled in European history, had been reduced to a shambling, frost-bitten horde of fewer than 40,000. They marched through snowdrifts that swallowed the dying, their tattered uniforms offering no protection against temperatures that plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Horses collapsed and were immediately carved apart by starving soldiers who ate the raw flesh while it still steamed in the cold. The Grande Armée, the pride of Napoleon Bonaparte, was not simply retreating, it was disintegrating, one frozen step at a time. Behind them lay Moscow, burned and abandoned. Ahead lay only the white infinity of the Russian winter. And in between, a trail of 400,000 dead marked their path like a ghastly breadcrumb trail across the frozen steppe. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the zenith of his power. From Spain to the borders of Russia, his empire dominated continental Europe. But Tsar Alexander I refused to bow to Napoleon's continental system, a blockade against British trade. To Napoleon, this defiance was an insult that could not stand. In June, he assembled the Grande Armée, a multinational force of French, Germans, Poles, Italians, and Dutch, and launched an invasion of Russia. His plan was swift and brutal: crush the Russian armies in a decisive battle, force Alexander to sue for peace, and be back in Paris before autumn. The army was the most modern of its time, with 1,300 cannon, sophisticated supply lines, and a corps system that allowed rapid movement. But Napoleon had underestimated the vastness of Russia, the tenacity of its people, and the unforgiving nature of its climate. The stage was set for one of history's greatest military catastrophes. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. Morale was high. The soldiers believed they would be home by Christmas. They marched eastward through the flat, dusty plains of Lithuania and Belarus. The Russian armies under Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration refused to give battle, retreating deeper into the interior while burning crops and villages behind them. This scorched earth policy denied the invaders food and fodder. Napoleon pushed his men harder, hoping to force a fight. They advanced through swamps and forests, plagued by dysentery and typhus. Horses died by the thousands from exhaustion and lack of forage. By the time they reached Smolensk in August, the army had already lost a third of its strength to disease, desertion, and starvation. Yet Napoleon pressed on, convinced that capturing Moscow would end the war. The optimism of June was fading, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. As the army advanced deeper into Russia, the first subtle warnings began to manifest. The summer heat gave way to cold rains in September. Soldiers noticed that the local peasants had vanished, taking their food stores with them. The supply system, designed for short campaigns, began to collapse. Forage parties returned empty-handed. Horses, already weakened, started dying in alarming numbers. Napoleon's own generals advised caution. They urged him to halt at Smolensk and negotiate. But the emperor, confident in his star, dismissed these concerns. He believed that the Russians would soon be forced to fight. On September 7th at Borodino, he finally got his battle. A bloody, indecisive slaughter that cost both sides over 70,000 casualties. The Russian army withdrew, battered but intact. Napoleon entered Moscow a week later expecting surrender. Instead, he found a deserted city that soon erupted in flames. The fire raged for 3 days, consuming 3/4 of the capital. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waited in Moscow, expecting Alexander to sue for peace. But the Tsar remained silent. The army huddled in the charred ruins, consuming the last of its supplies. Discipline began to erode. Soldiers looted what little remained, drinking and brawling. Meanwhile, winter was creeping in. The first snow fell in mid-October. Napoleon realized he had to retreat or starve. On October 19th, the order was given. The Grande Armée would march south, then west, toward the supply depot at Smolensk. The army left Moscow with over 40,000 wagons of loot and supplies, but the retreat had barely begun. The weather worsened daily. Temperatures dropped, and the roads turned to rivers of mud that froze into jagged ruts. Soldiers began to discard their loot as the weight became unbearable. The column stretched for miles, a slow-moving river of misery. The landscape was a bleak, white hell, empty, silent, and utterly indifferent to their suffering. The crisis point came in early November near the town of Krasny. Napoleon had hoped to reach Smolensk and regroup, but the Russian army under Kutuzov had paralleled his retreat, attacking the straggling columns. The French fought desperate rearguard actions, losing thousands each day. On November 9th, the temperature plunged to -20 degrees Celsius. Soldiers who stopped to rest froze to death where they sat. The road became a graveyard of men and horses. Napoleon himself narrowly escaped capture. But the true turning point was the decision to retreat along the same devastated route they had used during the invasion, a path stripped of all resources. The army's cohesion shattered. Units dissolved into leaderless mobs. Men fought over scraps of horseflesh. The weak were pushed aside to die. Napoleon, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, issued a bulletin admitting the army's suffering, but it was too late. The retreat had become a rout. The catastrophe reached its peak at the Berezina River in late November. The Russians had trapped the remnants of the Grande Armée against the partially frozen river, hoping to annihilate them. Napoleon ordered a desperate bridge-building operation. Engineers worked waist-deep in icy water, constructing 2 pontoon bridges under constant Russian fire. The crossing became a scene of utter chaos. Thousands of soldiers, camp followers, and civilians, men, women, and children, pushed onto the bridges, trampling the weak. The bridges collapsed repeatedly. Many fell into the freezing water and drowned or were crushed by the panicked masses. When the Russians finally attacked, the French rearguard fought a savage battle to buy time. By the time the last bridge was burned, over 25,000 people had died at the Berezina. The river was choked with corpses. Those who crossed emerged into a wasteland of snow and ice, with no shelter, no food, and no hope. The Grande Armée was no longer an army, it was a procession of ghosts. After the Berezina, the retreat became a nightmare beyond comprehension. Temperatures dropped to -38 degrees Celsius. Men's limbs turned black with frostbite. Some amputated their own fingers and toes with knives to avoid gangrene. Others went mad from cold and hunger, hallucinating or simply lying down to die. Cannibalism became widespread. Soldiers cut flesh from the bodies of their comrades and cooked it over fires made from the wreckage of wagons. The road from the Berezina to Vilnius was littered with frozen corpses, some still in marching positions, others huddled in groups. Napoleon himself abandoned the army on December 5th, racing back to Paris to raise a new force. His generals were left to lead the survivors. By the time the last stragglers crossed the Niemen River in mid-December, the Grande Armée had ceased to exist. Of the 600,000 men who had invaded Russia, fewer than 40,000 returned. The Russian campaign had consumed the cream of Napoleon's military power. The survivors, who limped into the Polish town of Vilnius in early December, found little relief. The city's hospitals were overwhelmed. Thousands died in makeshift wards, their frozen limbs rotting away. The French army's medical service had collapsed, and the wounded were left to die in the streets. Some soldiers found shelter in abandoned houses, only to be robbed and killed by marauding bands of deserters. The Russian winter did not relent. Even after crossing into Poland, the cold continued to claim victims. By the end of December, the last organized remnants of the Grande Armée had dispersed or been captured. Napoleon's invasion of Russia had failed catastrophically. The disaster shattered his aura of invincibility and emboldened his enemies. Prussia and Austria switched sides, and by 1814, Paris itself was occupied. The Russian campaign was the beginning of the end for Napoleon Bonaparte. The frozen corpses of his soldiers became a grim monument to the folly of overreaching ambition. The retreat from Moscow remains one of history's greatest military disasters, a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the arrogance of empire. The Grande Armée's destruction had profound consequences. It triggered the War of the Sixth Coalition, leading to Napoleon's first abdication in 1814. The Russian victory also fueled a sense of national destiny that would shape European politics for centuries. For historians, the campaign offers enduring lessons: the importance of logistics, the danger of underestimating an enemy's resolve, and the brutal reality that even the most brilliant commander cannot defy geography and climate. The name Berezina became a French synonym for catastrophe. Today, the bones of 400,000 soldiers lie scattered across the fields and forests of Russia, a silent warning to any leader who believes that will alone can conquer nature. If this story of hubris and horror has gripped you, subscribe to Dark Docs for more tales of doomed expeditions. History's darkest moments hold the brightest lessons.